The next three sessions, I'm going to be discussing the ongoing dispute over slavery during the 1850s and the escalating sectional tension that leads to the secession of the southern states and the Civil War. I'm going to start with the election of 1852. Now, this is the same year that Uncle Tom's Cabin is published, so there's a heightened sense of this sectional tension over the issue of slavery during this year. So, as I've said many times before, whenever there's an election in the midst of a national crisis or some sort of an issue, a controversial issue, that issue becomes a campaign issue. And that's more or less the case with the election of 1852. The issue of slavery is foremost in the minds of most politicians and most Americans, because for the past couple of years it's been the center of this ongoing debate. Will slavery be allowed to expand into the Western territories? And if so, who gets to decide whether or not this happens? So this is this is center stage in politics right now. So the election of 1852 is going to focus heavily on these types of issues. The Compromise of 1850 pretty much killed the Whigs as a national party. They're still in existence in this election of 1852. They're still going to run a candidate. The Whigs will nominate Winfield Scott, another Mexican War veteran, a hero. He's from Virginia. They refused to nominate or renominate Millard Fillmore because they saw this Compromise of 1850, which Fillmore endorsed, as too pro-Southern. And of course, Southern Whigs, a lot of the Southern Whigs are going to quit and join the Democratic Party because they had become angry over the anti-slavery rhetoric of the Northern Whigs. So the Whig Party is in the process of kind of pulling itself apart here over this issue of slavery. But they're still together enough as a party to run a candidate in this 1852 election. That's Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott is a Southerner. He's from Virginia, but few Southern Whigs really see him as a friend of their region because Scott does not own any slaves. He's not a plantation owner. It's not his thing. So the Whigs are kind of reluctantly backing Winfield Scott. They even though they agree to nominate him, they're not really unified as a party, and the internal tensions within their party is going to basically spell their downfall. The Democratic Party, however, is much more unified and united as a party during this 1852 election, and they're going to nominate Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. Now, here's the thing: Pierce is a Northerner, but he has a lot of appeal to Southern Democrats because he's an expansionist, and Pierce really puts forth this idea of manifest destiny, territorial expansion, which is a popular idea across the whole nation, not just one region or another. So this idea of territorial expansion is enjoys a lot of widespread popularity, and the Democrats with Pierce as their candidate are going to basically walk away with this election, being much more unified than the Whigs. It's much more easy for them to rally the support that they need to get Pierce elected. In fact, Pierce is going to walk away with this election. It's a landslide. So during the campaign, Pierce and the Democrats really push this expansion, this territorial expansion agenda. In fact, they don't really say much about the issue of slavery. They try to stay focused on this idea that's popular to everybody. Whereas the Whigs, they're still kind of focused on this anti-slavery in the territories agenda, and that kind of loses them a lot of widespread support. So the Democrats are going to walk away with this election. Pierce will be elected president, and despite the fact that Pierce wins this in a landslide, it doesn't really obscure the fact that the nation is very divided. Even though he won, hands down in this election, the nation is still very divided over this issue of slavery. Slavery in the territories, and the American political parties are very divided within themselves. We already talked about the Whigs are already breaking apart as a result of this. By the end of the 1850s, the Democrat Party will also suffer a similar breakup. Northern and Southern Democrats are increasingly at odds with each other over this issue of slavery. So the Democrat Party is going to suffer the same fate a few years later, but for now the Whigs are kind of going away after this 1852 election. So once Pierce is elected as president, he begins to put forth his agenda of territorial expansion. That's what he campaigned on. Considers his election now a mandate for that agenda. So he begins to set about this task of acquiring new territories. Pierce advocates for the annexation of Hawaii. The United States in the 1850s had already begun establishing what amounts to a colony in Hawaii, some sugar plantations and so forth. So there was already a U.S. presence in Hawaii. Pierce is advocating now for annexation of that territory. And of course, he's talking about expanding American influence in Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, acquiring new territory from Mexico, and Spain too. So Pierce and the Democrats have set their sights far and wide in terms of territorial expansion. They're now looking beyond the continental United States for potential expansion. And this has a lot of popularity in terms of just the idea of manifest destiny. They're basically, this becomes kind of an extension of that idea that America's territorial expansion was ordained by God. Now, Pierce makes it clear that he's not going to allow the tension and divisions over this issue of slavery to interfere with America's territorial expansion. He's like, I know we've got a lot of problems in this country right now over the issue of slavery. I get it, but I'm not going to allow that to interfere with America's goal of expansion. So he makes it very clear that expansion is his main priority. What ends up happening, though, is that Pierce is, even though he's a Northerner, a lot of Northerners are kind of suspicious of Pierce. Because he's so married to this idea of territorial expansion, a lot of Northerners criticize him as being basically a pawn of Southern interests. And of course, the Northerners have long suspected that Southerners' interest in territorial expansion is for the purpose of expanding slavery. So they see Pierce now as kind of looking like a pawn of Southern interests. Especially considering the fact that many of Pierce's cabinet members are Southern states' rights advocates. Jefferson Davis, as a matter of fact, was Pierce's Secretary of War. So basically, President Pierce's top advisor in his cabinet is one of the most radical pro-Southern states' rights advocates. So this is another thing that causes Northerners to suspect that Pierce is just acting on the interests of Southerners. There's going to be a big scandal resulting from this expansionist agenda over Cuba specifically. This Austin Manifesto in 1854 is a big political scandal surrounding the U.S. attempt to acquire Cuba. Basically, what happens is that Cuba had long been an attractive piece of land for Southern plantation owners. Cuba at this time is still owned by Spain. It's still a Spanish colony. In fact, Cuba and Puerto Rico, just a couple of the last two little scraps of the former Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba is essentially one giant sugar plantation. It's an island. It's an island colony. Sugar is the almost the exclusive export of this Spanish colony, and it's a very lucrative operation. Sugar is still a very valuable commodity in the world trade, and Southerners have long eyed this, or had their eye on this colony as a potential expansion of their territory. If we could get Cuba and gain access to this lucrative sugar, the sugar plantations, it could really go a long way toward expanding influence of southern states. So southern states had already had their eye on this for a while. So what happens is it becomes kind of an obvious target for this idea of expansion. So in 1854, Pierce offers Spain $130 million for the purchase of Cuba. Spain is going to decline. Again, Cuba is kind of a symbol. It's lucrative and profitable, but it's just as important as a symbol of Spain's once great empire. So Spain is very reluctant to give up Cuba, and they decline Pierce's offer. Later on that same year, this is still 1854, a group of U.S. ambassadors at a conference in Ostend, Belgium. They're there negotiating with Spain. They're still discussing this issue of Cuba and trying to talk Spain into agreeing to this offer. Well, in the course of this conference in Ostend, one of Pierce's diplomats, a guy named James Buchanan, and of course James Buchanan will go on to be president in a few years, but and in the course of this conference, the diplomats send a letter to the U.S. Secretary of State. In this letter, they suggest that the U.S. consider using military force to seize Cuba if Spain continued to refuse to sell. Now, this is just a suggestion. In this letter, these American diplomats, in the process of this negotiation, they say, "Hey, Secretary of State, we should consider using military force to just seize Cuba if Spain won't sell." Now, the Secretary of State does not act on this. The Secretary of State can't authorize the use of military force. He can advise the president. The president can advise Congress, but no action is taken on this. It's just a letter containing a suggestion, a proposal. Well, this is just one of the big traps of politics. If you don't want people to find out about something, don't ever write it down. And so the fact that they wrote this is just talk. It's just a suggestion, a proposal. But the fact that it's written down in this letter, this dispatch sent from the delegates in Ostend to the Secretary of State, it comes out. People hear about it. Somebody reads it who shouldn't have read it, and now the press get a hold of it, and they call it this Ostend Manifesto. It becomes a huge political scandal for the Pierce administration. Even though Pierce himself never endorsed this, the Secretary of State never acted on it, nothing ever happens as a result of this Ostend Manifesto, as the press called it. The fact that members of the Pierce administration were discussing using military force to seize foreign territory for the purpose of expansion, it looks really bad for the Pierce administration. The press, of course, they really run away with it. Northern congressmen and people in the North are outraged over this. They start to this Ostend Manifesto. It kind of reinforces Northern suspicions of the Pierce administration as a pawn of Southern interests. People start accusing Pierce of, okay, this whole expansionist agenda that you've been advertising it looks like it's just for the purpose of expanding slavery for the sake of the Southern interest. So a lot of Northerners start calling this a conspiracy. Pierce is just using his expansionist agenda to expand Southern interests, particularly slavery. So this is a big political scandal. It really hurts the Pierce administration, makes him look bad in front of all of his opponents, and of course this is just another one of those things that helps to further aggravate this already existing tension between North and South. North and South are already at odds with each other over this issue of slavery, and this Ostend Manifesto, while nothing ever comes of it, this scandal itself helps to further this rift between North and South. And again, this is just one of the things about politics. perception is everything. Even though Pierce did not ever act on this, the fact that it was being discussed, it creates the perception that the Pierce administration is operating in the interests of Southern slaveholders. So perception is everything, and this just regardless of what actually happened, the perceptions are real, and the perceptions go a long way toward aggravating this tension. Well, while President Pierce is fumbling through this foreign policy debacle and this scandal, a senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, and we've already introduced ourselves to Douglas a week or two ago when we were talking about the Compromise of 1850. Douglas was instrumental in getting that Compromise of 1850 passed through Congress. Douglas now is going to come onto the stage again with a proposal for a transcontinental railroad. And Douglas has the idea that if we start focusing on this idea of a transcontinental railroad, maybe that will help distract the nation from all these tensions and troubles in this sectional dispute, because a transcontinental railroad is something that would benefit the whole nation. It supports the idea of territorial expansion, basically connecting our eastern established states with the frontier areas with more direct connection. It'll help facilitate settlement of those frontier areas and so forth, and help the nation grow. And there's not a whole lot to find fault with here in this transcontinental railroad proposal. And just to kind of take a look at an illustration here to see what Douglas is proposing. Douglas is proposing that we take this, the remaining territory of this old Louisiana Purchase, which basically is this Nebraska, Kansas territory here. Take this territory, organize it into a Nebraska territory, and for the purpose of settlement, and then start construction of a transcontinental railroad. Now, of course, there's already railroad lines connecting the east to Omaha, in terms of through Illinois, Iowa, Missouri. There's already railroad lines all through here. So what Douglas is talking about is just this section connecting Omaha out to the Utah territory, basically this first big leg of what will eventually be a transcontinental railroad. So this is Douglas's proposal. Now Douglas, first of all, a lot of people question that. Southerners kind of question this. They're like, okay, why does this railroad line going to go through the north? This Nebraska territory that you're talking about, this is all of this is in the northern territory. It'll bring prosperity to these northern states with this railroad line going through here, and it'll also, since all this territory is above the old Missouri Compromise line, that means all of this territory is going to be organized eventually as a free state, which means it'll give the North an even bigger advantage over the South here with a new free state. So Southerners are kind of opposed to Douglas's proposal initially. And of course, even though Southerners agree that a transcontinental rail line would be a good thing for the nation, they're like, why not put it in the South? Why not put it down here in the South instead of in the North? So this becomes a point of contention, and and of course, people accuse Douglas of just trying to look out for his own interests in terms of this is going to benefit Illinois, because Illinois is already kind of a railroad center, especially around Chicago. Extending this transcontinental line from Illinois through the northern route here would bring a lot of additional prosperity to Illinois. Well, this is basically Douglas's job. As a U.S. Senator from Illinois, it is his job to represent the interests of his state. So he's just doing his job here by promoting something that's going to benefit his state. Well, in the course of this debate, Southerners rejected. Okay, we don't want this railroad line in the north there. It's just going to be too much benefit for the north and not really any benefit for the south. So Douglas revises his proposal, and he comes up with what will eventually be called the Kansas and Nebraska Act. And this is in 1854. So this is basically a year later. He resubmits his railroad proposal as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So basically, what this Kansas-Nebraska Act does, it takes that existing territory, this Nebraska territory, it splits it into two, a Nebraska territory and a Kansas territory. Another thing it does is this is one of the really big pieces of this. It repeals the Missouri Compromise line. Remember that 36 degrees, 30 north latitude that delineated free territory from slave territory. Douglas says, let's just get rid of that. Let's get rid of this old Missouri Compromise line, and we'll open up this entire territory to the idea of popular sovereignty. So in this Kansas and Nebraska territory, we will allow the people living there to decide for themselves the status of slavery, just like we did with those Southwest territories that we got from Mexico. So of course, Southerners are much more attracted to this idea with these two new provisions. The idea of popular sovereignty is very agreeable to the South. Getting rid of the Missouri Compromise line basically will allow slavery to expand into whatever territories it wants to organically, as long as the people there support it. So there's a lot of support for this in Congress. Of course, the South universally supports it. There's enough support from Northern congressmen in order to get it to pass. So it passes in 1854. President Pierce signs it. It becomes a law in May of 1854. So the fact that it passed is going to create a lot of problems. Douglas was hoping that this idea, this transcontinental railroad idea, would bring the nation together, and instead it has just the opposite effect. This Kansas-Nebraska Act is probably one of the single most controversial pieces of legislation in terms of dividing the nation politically in history up to this point. So at any rate, Northerners are outraged over this because they were able to make peace with popular sovereignty in the Southwest territories. Those were new territories just recently acquired. But this Kansas and Nebraska territory, this is part of the old Louisiana Purchase, which has been part of the United States for the past 50 years. So then, of course, it's already been officially closed or off limits to slavery since the Missouri Compromise for the past 20 years, 30 years. So Northerners are outraged. They say, okay, this Kansas-Nebraska Act basically has taken what was already designated as free territory and now opened it to the potential expansion of slavery. Northerners are furious over this, especially Northerners who represent abolitionist constituents. This is enormously controversial. In fact, this is going to set off this Kansas-Nebraska Act. When it passes, it's going to trigger a massive realignment of political parties as a result of this. We're going to see basically one of the big. Well, actually, let's take a look at another map here, just to kind of show you what the end result here. We're basically comparing our Kansas-Nebraska Act with our old Compromise of 1850. Compromise of 1850 took those Southwest territories that were obtained from Mexico and opened those up to popular sovereignty. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, as proposed by Douglas, will do the same thing with the remainder of this old Louisiana Purchase territory. Taking this territory, dividing it into a Nebraska territory and a Kansas territory, and opening up the entire region to popular sovereignty as a way of determining the status of slavery. Basically, the Missouri Compromise line, which, this 36 degree 30, which extended all the way out here, Douglas says just get rid of it. Just get rid of it. It serves no purpose anymore. It's just kind of in the way. And of course, now, basically, all of this territory, this Nebraska, Kansas, Utah, and New Mexico territory, all of this is potentially open to the expansion of slavery. And this is what aggravates Northerners so badly over this, is that now potentially slavery could expand all through these frontier territories. One of the big impacts, the most immediate impact of this is the Northern outrage over this Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to trigger a realignment of political parties. Specifically, a new political party is going to emerge here, a new Republican Party. Now, this is not connected in any way with the previous Republican Party that we talked about years ago. This is a brand new Republican Party. They call themselves Republicans after Thomas Jefferson's Republican Party, but this new Republican Party, agenda-wise, is very similar to the old Federalists and the Whigs in terms of what they what the types of agenda that they put forth. But mainly, at least initially in 1854, this Republican Party is formed to oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act. A lot of the people that joined this new Republican Party are basically all the people who oppose this Kansas-Nebraska Act. They present themselves as the party of freedom. Their main agenda now is their opposition to slavery, specifically the expansion of slavery. Now, it's important to note that the Republicans do not present themselves as an abolitionist party. They're not trying to destroy slavery, but they are actively attempting to prevent the expansion of slavery. So they are opposed to the expansion of slavery. Now, while they are not abolitionists as a party, many abolitionists will join the Republican Party because the two groups, the Republicans opposed to expansion of slavery and the abolitionists opposed to slavery, period, they're closely aligned enough to where a lot of abolitionists will join the Republican Party. And as you might already have guessed, the Republican Party is a sectional party, meaning that there are no Southerners joining the Republican Party. None. Not one single Southerner joins the Republican Party. The only people who join this Republican Party are Northerners. So this Republican Party exists only in the North. It is a sectional party. And this is because of their stance on slavery. Now, the Democratic Party is still a nationwide party. There are Northern Democrats and there are Southern Democrats. So the Democratic Party is more universal here, whereas the Republican Party is strictly a sectional party. Referring once again here to our little genealogy of U.S. political parties, here's where we are right here, 1854, the formation of this new Republican Party. A lot of the former Whig Party had just kind of broken apart recently in 1852. So those former Whigs are going to join this Republican Party. Remember the Free Soil Party that emerged during the 1848 election? A lot of these guys are going to join the Republican Party. Some anti-slavery Democrats which had joined the Free Soil Party, these guys will be part of the Republican Party. Later on, as we get closer to the Civil War, and we see the Democratic Party start to break apart along sectional lines, we'll see some Northern Democrats migrating into the Republican Party during right along the time of the Civil War. But initially, it's just made up of former Whigs and the Free Soilers. Basically, they are opposed to the expansion of slavery, so that's why they are a Northern-only party. So this new Republican Party, anti-slavery party, the opposed to the expansion of slavery, only has appeal in the North. What ends up happening is that they're going to what's most notable about this new Republican Party is how quickly they amass support and win converts, so to speak. The 1854 midterm election is probably really the best example of how quickly this new Republican Party had gained support. Now, normally we don't talk about midterm elections in this class. It's kind of a small scale event. It doesn't really warrant a lot of focus. But in this particular case, in 1854, it really is kind of unusual because in these 1854 midterm elections, now that we're talking about the election of congressmen here, representatives to Congress. So in these 1854 midterm elections, most of the Northern congressmen who had supported the Kansas and Nebraska Act are going to be voted out of office. A lot of Northern Democrats will be replaced with these Republicans in this midterm election. Now, it doesn't give the Republicans a majority in Congress, but it gives them a very significant minority. Basically, in this one election, Republicans gained 44 seats in Congress as a result of people who were angry at those Northern representatives for supporting the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So this is a big deal. This is a huge chunk of Congress now won by this new Republican Party. and their support is going to continue to grow in the next presidential election. And then, of course, the further we get to the end of the 1850s, the Republican Party will continue gaining support. And, of course, they'll eventually win in the 1860 election with Abraham Lincoln. But for now, they're off to a very quick and good start in terms of winning a lot of support. These 1854 midterm elections. Basically, this is kind of a signal that things are changing. There's a lot of political support for preventing slavery from expanding. So this the anti-slavery faction in America is really starting to gain some significant political support, as evidenced by this 1854 midterm election. Within Congress, especially after the 1854 midterms, Congress now becomes basically dominated by this issue of slavery. The general attitude within Congress is very belligerent, a lot of posturing, dividing Congress into camps, North and South, anti-slavery, pro-slavery. In fact, as a congressman or a senator during this time period, basically from now on, the only thing anybody really cares about is your position on slavery. If you're a congressman or a senator, you're talking to the press or you're talking to your constituents, the first thing they ask is, what is your position on slavery? Are you for it or against it? No one's really concerned much about other aspects of your agenda or your political affiliations, party-wise. They want to know whether you are for or against slavery. And this becomes the central focus of a lot of debate. No matter what Congress is debating, what bill is on the floor at the particular moment, slavery becomes part of that debate. So this is becoming the dominant theme in politics throughout the remainder of the 1850s, is what is going to happen with this issue of slavery. Ultimately, what's going to end up happening too is that as a result of this Kansas-Nebraska Act, Kansas now becomes kind of the focus of this larger issue of expansion of slavery. You want to talk about the issue of expansion of slavery expanding into the territories. Kansas now has become kind of the epicenter of this debate. What's going to happen with Kansas? Because while at the time there was hardly anybody living in this Nebraska territory, there were quite a few people moving into Kansas at this point. So it's clear to everyone that while Kansas is not ready to become a state anytime in the next couple of years, Kansas is almost certainly going to be the next state. It's still a couple of years away, like I said, but it is going to be the next state. And of course, this issue of slavery and popular sovereignty, this makes Kansas now the central focus of both sides of this debate, trying to determine the future of Kansas. This illustration here from a newspaper which is obviously opposed to slavery. They're using this as kind of a metaphor, highlighting that this democratic agenda, the democratic platform, this so-called territorial expansion agenda, is basically nothing more than a thinly veiled disguise for the expansion of slavery. The artist here calling that the whole issue of Kansas, the issue of Cuba, and expansion of influence in Central America, all of this is designed to further the expansion of slavery. So basically the metaphor here is that pro-slavery advocates are, with this idea of popular sovereignty, are essentially forcing slavery down the throats of everybody who's opposed to it. So people who live on the frontier who might be opposed to slavery, they're going to be forced to accept slavery now because of this Kansas-Nebraska Act and the idea of popular sovereignty. And of course, this is a dramatic metaphor here, but the point they're trying to make is that the support for slavery is growing, and it appears to be spreading across the entire nation. Now, since Kansas is likely to become the next state, it is now the center of focus for this debate. Both sides, both anti-slavery groups and pro-slavery groups are now competing for Kansas. Since Kansas is not ready to become a state, this idea of popular sovereignty means that Kansas is up for grabs. Whichever side can get the most people there first and establish a territorial government and meet the population requirements for statehood, then they will get to determine whether or not Kansas becomes a slave or a free state. So this is a fierce competition. Kansas is literally up for grabs here, whichever side can get there first and establish it. And this becomes intense. There's a scramble out on the ground. Actually, in the Kansas territory, there's a scramble from settlers from both parts of the country scrambling there, trying to settle the area and establish themselves as the majority in Kansas. In Congress, it's being debated as well. Speaking for the radical abolitionists, northern perspective here, William Seward from New York, declares that we will engage in this competition for the soil of Kansas. The quicker we can get out there and establish an abolitionist presence, the quicker we can make Kansas a free state and prevent the spread of slavery. Speaking on behalf of the South, Senator Robert Barnwell Rhett. We've already talked about both of these guys. Rhett, like Seward, is a radical. So Rhett, speaking for the radical South, urging Southerners, if you can, move out there right now. Take your slaves with you, establish a plantation, get out there, and we need to establish a slave-holding majority in Kansas so that we can ensure that the future of Kansas protects the institution of slavery. So both in Congress and out on the ground in Kansas, we see this intense competition for dominance of this Kansas territory. And what ends up happening is that by 1855, now this is just a year after the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, the people living in Kansas hold a territorial election. Basically, this election is to elect a territorial government which will begin organizing this territory in preparation for statehood in the coming years. So again, in accordance with the process laid out by that old Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So they're holding these territorial elections trying to determine this new territorial government in Kansas. Now what ends up happening is that these elections take place in May. And at the time of these elections, there's only about 1,500 men actually registered to vote in the Kansas territory, legal residents in the Kansas territory. But over 6,000 votes are going to be cast in this election. And of course, already people are calling foul. Okay, how could 1,500 registered voters cast 6,000 votes? That's not even possible. And of course, what ended up happening was that a lot of people out of Missouri, slave owners out of Missouri, were crossing the border into Kansas and voting illegally in this Kansas election. And that's what created so many votes in this election. Now, what ends up happening is, of course, that when they count the votes, there's more votes for a pro-slavery government. So the pro-slavery government, which declares itself to be the government of Kansas Territory, they set up a headquarters or a capital in a town of Lecompton in Kansas. Well, a few days later, the anti-slavery people in Kansas are like, okay, that's not right. All those pro-slavery people, they don't even live in Kansas. They just came here and voted illegally. So the anti-slavery people who were living in Kansas already, they declared the election a fraud, and they organized their own government in Topeka. So we've got two governments both claiming legitimacy in the Kansas territory. And of course, we look at this here. Illustration, this is just kind of a cartoon illustration showing basically what's happening here is that a lot of people out of Missouri, keep in mind Missouri is a slave state, a lot of slave owners out of Missouri are migrating into Kansas for the purpose of tipping the balance in favor of the pro-slavery faction. A lot of these people don't even live here. They're not even registered to vote here, but they're voting in this Kansas election, and that's what tips the scale in favor of the pro-slavery faction. And of course, it's why the anti-slavery group declare that the election is invalid and of course form their own government. So on the map here, we've got a pro-slavery government claiming to be the legitimate government of Kansas in Lecompton. And of course, just down the road in Topeka, Kansas, we've got an anti-slavery government also claiming to be the legitimate governing authority in the Kansas Territory. So two separate governments, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery, both claiming to be the sole legitimate government in this territory. It's a mess. It is a mess in Kansas, and what we see is happening as a result is kind of a miniature civil war. And you see here, there's on the map, of course, there's several different skirmishes and incidents, outbreaks of violence over the coming year. Essentially, though, this is a mini civil war. We've got pro-slavery factions fighting against anti-slavery factions, both claiming to be the legitimate leaders of this territory. Neither side being willing to agree or yield here. And of course, there's no discussions. You know, the negotiation and discussion is not even on the table right now. They proceed straight away to fighting each other in a lot of these skirmishes. Of course, this artist here depicting a typical scene outside a courthouse in a Kansas town where pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions are fighting each other in the streets. Of course, they're fighting each other in these government houses in Kansas as well. It's a mess. It's a mess in Kansas. No one can determine who is the legitimate government of the Kansas Territory. So here's what happens when Congress reconvenes in 1856. You know, this is January 1856. All this has been happening over the summer and fall of 1855. This mini civil war in Kansas. When Congress comes back in session in January of 56, they're confronted with this issue. Okay, we got two separate governments out there in the Kansas Territory. Both of them claim to be the legitimate one. Who knows which one is right? We don't know. Congress is like, okay, we're not going to touch that. You know, the idea of popular sovereignty says let the people living in that territory decide the status of slavery. So Congress is very reluctant to weigh in on this because no matter which side Congress takes, it's gonna create a further divide in the nation. If Congress sides with the pro-slavery faction, then the Northerners will accuse Congress of being an agent of the South, and of course, if Congress sides with the anti-slavery part of Kansas, then the South will make the same accusation. So Congress doesn't really want to get involved with this. They're content to kind of let Kansas sort it out for themselves. President Pierce, however, he asks Congress to recognize the pro-slavery faction in Kansas. Of course, Congress won't really decide on this, but the fact that the president has endorsed this pro-slavery faction, it kind of emboldens the pro-slavery people in Kansas to take action, and that's what happens in May of 1856. A group of about 800 pro-slavery supporters ride into the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was an anti-slavery town, and they proceed to attack this town of Lawrence. They burn down the hotel. They loot several houses. They destroy a couple of abolitionist printing presses, and they killed one man. So this attack on Lawrence, Kansas, by pro-slavery supporters kind of marks a significant escalation of tension in the region. Now, of course, the story of this gets back to the press. In fact, the press kind of deemed this ordeal in Kansas as Bleeding Kansas. So this whole idea of Bleeding Kansas was a term that the press coined to refer to this situation. Now, when the story about Lawrence, the attack on Lawrence, gets to the newspapers back east, this is the illustration that appears in the newspaper. And as you can see, this is quite a dramatic image here. The whole town is on fire. People are being slaughtered in the streets. Pro-slavery men riding through the streets, murdering people, and even the church here in the background is on fire. It's a very dramatic image here. Not really very accurate, though. The press clearly is attempting to dramatize this issue in order to make a point. The attack on Lawrence did happen. Pro-slavery men did ride into the town of Lawrence and attack the place. They did burn down one building and they killed a man, but it wasn't quite as dramatic as the press made it out. Here, of course, another illustration in another newspaper showing that the one building that had been destroyed, and of course, one man killed. Not quite as dramatic as the previous image, but we see during this time period, just like today, controversial stories like this attack on Lawrence, they tend to be dramatized by the press in order to sell a story. So the same sort of thing is happening here in the 1850s. Just a couple days later, after this attack on Lawrence, Kansas, is perpetrated by pro-slavery factions, the anti-slavery faction is going to respond in kind. And a guy named John Brown, who is an ultra-radical abolitionist. In fact, based on the tactics that he used, one might even go so far as to label Brown a terrorist, because Brown was very brutal and very violent in the ways that he fought against slavery. So this is just a few days this is about 3 days after the attack on Lawrence. John Brown has decided to take matters into his own hands. Okay, the federal government's not going to protect us out here. We're left on our own to fight for what we believe in on our own here. Brown is convinced that he's on a crusade here to personally bring about the end of slavery. He sees it as his personal responsibility. Here, of course, is a photograph of Brown. Brown considers it his personal responsibility to bring about the end of slavery. In fact, Brown was once quoted as saying that, you cannot, he said the best way to bring about the end of slavery is to kill all the slave owners. So again, this is just kind of an indication of how Brown is very radical here. He's not just opposed to slavery. He thinks it's his personal mission in life to destroy the institution of slavery by killing as many slave owners as he possibly can. And that's what happens just a few days after the attack on Lawrence. This is still May of 56. Brown leads a small party, including his 4 sons and a couple of his friends, to a farm owned by a pro-slavery family in a place called Pottawatomie Creek. And Brown and his sons and his friends, they drag this family out of their house. They split open their skulls with swords, and they cut off their hands, and they disemboweled these pro-slavery family. So this is very violent, very brutal, and it's just kind of an example of how this issue of slavery has turned a corner here in Kansas. It is no longer simply an abstract concept that is debated in the halls of Congress. This is something that's being fought to the death out in Kansas. And so basically, after this escalation, the attack at Lawrence, Kansas, and John Brown's attack on this pro-slavery family at Pottawatomie Creek, both of these incidents mark a significant escalation of this fighting in Kansas. It's no longer just debating a disputed election. People are actively engaged in killing each other. This is in May. These 2 incidents take place in May of 56. By the time we get to the fall of 56, in October, more than 200 people have been killed as a result of this violence in Kansas. Basically, things have kind of degenerated into a guerrilla war, with neighbors killing neighbors, whole towns fighting against other towns. Like I said, it's just kind of a miniature civil war. A lot of what will characterize the Civil War in terms of this neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother sort of dynamic, a lot of that is already going on in Kansas here in 1856. The Civil War is still about 5 years away at this point. So we're kind of getting a preview of what's going to happen in the Civil War out here in Kansas. Now, at this point, this violence in Kansas is no longer a political issue anymore. They're not. It's not really necessarily fighting for a cause. The issue of slavery is kind of the catalyst that sets this off. But this degenerates when it becomes a guerrilla war. Basically, it's nothing but reprisal attacks and revenge killings. Okay, some pro-slavery people killed my brother last week. I'm gonna go kill some pro-slavery people this week, and it's just one reprisal attack and revenge killings. And that's one of the reasons why it's so violent and bloody. It's, a lot of it's being motivated by hate and animosity toward the other group. Political issues and agendas, any kind of actual political goals are kind of out the window at this point. It's just kind of a every man for himself madness in Kansas. Well, while that's going on out in Kansas, while the people are killing each other out in Kansas, things aren't much better in Congress. Within the Senate, we see outbreaks of violence, physical violence, people attacking each other over this issue of slavery. And one good example is this incident between Charles Sumner and Preston Brooks. In May of '56, right around the same time things are getting violent out in Kansas, Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts is giving a speech. He speaks for 2 whole days in the Senate, going on and on about what's going on out in Kansas. This disputed election, this illegal voting of slave owners in this Kansas election, and the violence that resulted. Sumner labels this a crime against Kansas, as he put it in his speech. In his speech, he names names. He accuses the South of orchestrating a conspiracy to spread slavery into Kansas and turn Kansas into a slave state. He even accuses some senators specifically of having have masterminded this conspiracy to expand slavery. So Sumner doesn't pull any punches. He is very belligerent in his speech here, accusing Southerners of orchestrating all this violence in Kansas. Well, a couple days later, while Sumner is working at his desk in the Senate chamber, a representative, congressman from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, sneaks up behind him and proceeds to start beating him with his cane. Brooks beat Sumner so badly, beat him almost half to death. Beat him so badly that he broke his cane in several pieces. In the end, it's going to take Sumner over 3 years to recover from his injuries as a result of this beating. And what's particularly disturbing about this is that it takes place in the front of numerous witnesses right there in the Senate chamber. People are watching. Nobody attempts to intervene. Northern senators are saying, "This is an outrage. How dare he take that kind of an action?" Southern senators are in the background, as you can see here, as in this newspaper illustration. They're laughing and clapping. So this is just kind of an example of how bad things have gotten, even within Congress. People are not hesitating to use violence. This newspaper illustration, of course, kind of presenting this as a criticism of Brooks and the South, of course, in general. Sumner will become a martyr for the cause, basically, in the cause of freedom and in the North. Sumner's kind of a martyr now. Brooks will be hailed as a hero in the South. In fact, a group of Charleston, South Carolina businessmen got together and purchased a new cane for Sumner, or for Brooks, and they had it engraved with the phrase "hit him again." So Brooks is seen as kind of a hero in the South. A lot of Southerners are saying we need more men like Brooks who aren't afraid to go and beat the hell out of people for our cause. And of course, Sumner, the victim here, becoming a martyr for this cause of Northern opposition to slavery. And again, this is just an example of how bad things have become. And this is not an isolated incident. Over the coming months and years, especially during this whole Kansas issue, it was not uncommon for senators or congressmen to arm themselves. There were several instances of violent outbreaks in Congress, fist fights and shoving matches and so forth. A lot of congressmen started carrying weapons into the sessions of Congress, senators and representatives alike. Things got so bad at one point, one senator commented to the press that his quote was, "The only people who do not have a revolver and a knife are those that have 2 revolvers." again, an indication of the fact that even within Congress, violence is seen as a reasonable alternative to debate. So the 1850s have a rough start. You all starting with the debate over California, and of course renewed now with the debate over Kansas and the violence that ensues. The 1850s are going to continue in this manner. And things kind of pick up after this. We see that every year, sometimes several times within a year, there's going to be these major incidents that are going to further escalate this tension between North and South. And at this point, a lot of people are saying to themselves that we're past the point of no return here. It doesn't look good for America. A lot of people in government and of course citizens are struggling to foresee a way out, and it looks like that war might be inevitable if we keep going down this path that we're on right here. And that's just what we're going to continue talking about over the next couple of sessions, is these types of things happening in the 1850s and how it further pushes the nation toward a civil war that looks almost inevitable at this point. And that's where we'll pick it up next session.